David, we'll just interrupt and take you to Richard Marles speaking in Melbourne.
To the Parliament, despite the fact that the Prime Minister had assured us more than 2 weeks ago that this would happen. On Tuesday, we learn that the legal advice, which questions the very constitutionality of the citizenship legislation, had not been provided to the Cabinet when it made its decision. And we discover that by virtue of another damaging Cabinet leak. On Thursday, we find out that only 2 ministers have been shown the legislation, despite the fact that it's meant to have gone to the National Security Committee, and so neither the Foreign Minister, nor the Defence Minister, nor the Counter-Terrorism Minister have seen the legislation. And all the while, the Communications Minister has helpfully been providing a running commentary about his views on this issue, showing us the depths of the division within the Cabinet and within the government about the citizenship legislation, and the Communication Minister has been at it again today. Now, the only thing that we have seen from the government during the week was a leaked question time brief about the citizenship legislation. It had 8 key points. In it, the phrase national security is not used once. But 3 of those points are about politically positioning the Labor Party. For Tony Abbott, this is all about the politics, and it is not about keeping our nation safe. And you cannot do national security by focus group. What you need to do, if we're going to have national security and keep our people safe, is to have a calm, a thorough, a methodical decision-making process where Cabinet is in charge. And that is not what we've seen from this government. Now, Labor has made it very clear, consistently, from the time this was first raised, that we support an updating of the Citizenship Act. But we just want to have a mature conversation with a grown-up partner about how we can do that, and we certainly do not have that partner in this government. And so I find myself this week saying, as I did this time last week, that we need to see the legislation, and the government actually needs to start talking to us about how we can do what the government needs to do.
The Prime Minister says the process of how this legislation has gone through was quite normal. In fact, it only went to the 2 ministers. So what's your issue with it?
There's nothing normal about this process. If this was a normal process, we would not be having Cabinet leak after Cabinet leak about what's been going on. The idea that only 2 ministers have been shown this legislation is absolutely ridiculous. This is a profound piece of legislation. It's hard to think of a more important piece of legislation for any country than the legislation which provides for its citizenship. And here we are, a matter of great significance, the government tells us, about our nation's security, and only 2 ministers have seen it, despite the fact that this was first put into the public discourse more than a year ago. You know, rather than kite flying, rather than sniffing the political wind, we actually need a government which is responding to the questions of our national security and working through them in a methodical way, and doing so in a bipartisan way, and having that conversation with the other side of politics. We're ready to do that, but the government are refusing to talk to us.
Just putting the issue of how it was raised aside, what do you actually think about the legislation? What's your view? What's Labor's stance? What will Labor do in the Parliament next week?
Well, good question, and we've been very consistent about this from the moment that this was first raised. We support an updating of the Citizenship Act. We support the law as it stands, which provides that any person who takes up arms against Australia loses their citizenship. Now, that is constructed at the moment in a traditional state-on-state conflict or context. Updating that to take into account a phenomenon like ISIS is a principle that we support, ensuring that along the way we don't render people stateless. Now, we've been saying that from the outset. A sensible approach and an important thing to do, but we need to have a conversation with the government about the detail of that, so that we can work through it in a way which doesn't have any unintended consequences, and we want to do that in a constructive and in a bipartisan manner. But what we're seeing from the government, despite our requests for briefings, is a complete refusal to brief us because, frankly, they don't know what to brief us about, and a total inability for us to have a grown-up conversation about a very important matter for our nation.
What do you make of Mark Dreyfus's comments yesterday and I guess the backlash that came from the Prime Minister? Has there been a bit of talk in shadow cabinet about this? What's your personal view on it?
Well, again, I think what you see on the part of the government is it's all about politics. It's all about trying to engage in political point scoring around a question of our nation's security. And I think it's appalling that you see this from the point of view of the government. Comes back to that leaked question time brief, all about politically positioning Labor, not about our nation's security. I mean, you wouldn't see the Prime Minister talking in that way if what we were doing were having a grown-up, bipartisan conversation about how to pursue an important matter of national security in our nation's interest in a way which keeps Australians safe. That's what we should be doing.
You're not rebuking or slapping down Mr Dreyfus to any of your caucus colleagues on this one?
Oh, of course not. I mean, I think that there are a whole lot of questions that are legitimately raised in relation to the proposed legislation. And we want to see it so that we can, raise those questions and have a conversation about it. And I think all that you saw Mark saying during the week was raising one of those points. But rather than actually having a grown-up conversation about it, rather than working through the issues, making sure there are no unintended consequences, making sure that this legislation sits appropriately with the foreign fighters legislation, which was passed through the Parliament last year, and I think that's what Mark Dreyfus was alluding to. Rather than dealing with all of this, what we've got is a Prime Minister who is absolutely obsessed with political point scoring, even though we're talking about a matter of our national security.
Just to change the subject, how long can Bill Shorten maintain his silence on mounting damaging allegations he dudded workers during his time in the AWU?
Well, firstly, Bill has made it abundantly clear that he is very happy to answer all the issues which have been raised in the media and by the government. But let's be really clear here. What we have seen is an $80 million smear campaign of the Australian Labor Party and of the Leader of the Opposition in particular. $80 million. And we saw that in relation to agreements that were talked about yesterday, which turn out to be agreements of the most impeccable kind, agreements which actually ended up giving record rates for a civil construction project in Australia. Now, I think that Bill has been very clear that he wants to address these issues and he wants to address them as soon as he possibly can. As you know, he's written to the Royal Commission asking that he be able to appear before the Royal Commission as soon as that is possible. So Bill is not running away from any of this. He wants to meet this. And frankly, if we're going to have a trial of Bill Shorten's union career and what he has achieved for working people, then that is ground that we are very happy to go on, because Bill Shorten is very happy to put himself up against the Prime Minister on the question of working people any day of the week.
Mr Marles, where's Mr Shorten today? Why isn't he out here?
I don't precisely know the answer to that question, but I can tell you this. Bill is not being distracted by any of these issues from the task of holding this government to account. And it's a pretty hopeless government. I mean, there's been a whole lot of stuff going on this week in relation to the contempt that this government has shown towards national security. Bill's wanted to prosecute that issue. There's been a whole lot that's gone on this week in the way in which this government has done dirty deals with the Greens, which ends up dudding pensioners. Bill's wanted to hold the government to account on that question. Bill Shorten will address these issues, has made it clear he's going to, has written to the Royal Commission so that he can appear before it as quickly as possible. But in saying that, he's not about to be distracted from doing the really important work that the Australian people expect him to do and holding this rotten government to account.
Is Mr Shorten in hiding?
Of course he's not in hiding. I mean, Bill Shorten has been speaking time and again throughout the week on all the issues that I've just mentioned, which is why I went through them. I mean,
he hasn't held a news conference today or yesterday. Usually he holds a daily, if not...
I don't think I can't remember a more accessible leader of the opposition than Bill Shorten. I mean, if you're now holding up the standard that the leader of the opposition must do a stand-up press conference every day, and unless he does it, somehow he's not facing the media, I think that is ultimately a ridiculous proposition. Bill Shorten has been representing the Australian people with vigour and without distraction from this $80 million smear campaign. Now, in relation to the issues which have been raised, he's made it very clear he is totally happy to answer all of these questions, do it in front of the Royal Commission and do it as soon as possible, and he's put all of that in writing.
Can I just ask you about the government's deal with Iran on asylum seekers? Is Labor comfortable with such a deal?
Look, I'd need to... I'm not familiar with the specifics of that, so I think I'd need to take that on notice and give you an answer at another stage. Sure. Thank you.
That is the Shadow Immigration Minister, Richard Marles, holding a news conference in